A Facebook friend of mine and fellow cyclist with me put the following on his Facebook page this past week. Said, if there were proof that a God exists, you wouldn't believe in it, you'd have knowledge of it. You wouldn't need faith because you'd have facts, and these facts could then be proven to anyone else. They could be repeated, tested, and demonstrated. Now, obviously, this friend of mine is an atheist. He finds us faith folks a little fluffy and out of touch with reality. And truthfully, I don't always disagree with everything he has to say. I happen to think that science and the scientific method are worth paying attention to and trusting. I also think that he's right that some religious people are out of touch, that with some of our biblical literalism, we look kind of silly to a world shaped by modern thought and scientific understandings. Yet, nonetheless, I feel somewhat sad for my friend. As a person of faith, I am convinced that life cannot be captured by the so-called facts, that the deepest things in life cannot be proven, and they cannot always be measured. I'm one of those people who can be suspicious, particularly of the educators and the leaders of communities who talk about goals that always have to be measurable. And I get it. Sometimes we establish goals that are not very specific. You know, in 2023, we're going to love more people. Well, very interesting and quite lovely. I mean, how will you know that you have loved more people? You want to be able to measure behaviors in terms of what they can give us practically. So I understand these folks who always want measurable goals, but still, I am convinced life cannot always be measured. The most important things in life are not built around measurability or certainty, but around trust, risk, promise. The deepest things in life always entail a leap of faith. God can never, ever be proven. And I would suggest, by the way, that you run from those who want to prove God to you. They often know entirely too much. Belief in God is always a risky leap. You could be wrong. It seems to me that our biblical readings for today are all about faith and trust. That's what we mean by faith, by the way, not belief, but trust and promise. The first reading speaks of the word of the Lord that came to Abram in a vision. And we are told in a seeing and hearing experience, Abram encounters God, who invites him, first of all, not to be afraid. Whenever the heavenly realm shows up to the earthly realm in the Bible, the first words often are, do not be afraid. Why? Because I guess we human beings tend to live by a lot of fear. Abram, do not fear. For God says God is going to be Abram's shield, and God holds a great reward for him. And Abram, who is no pansy, responds to God with, really, God? What are you going to do to prove it? For I'm in a bad way, and you got to understand what life was like in the days of biblical days. He says, I don't have any kids, and kids are the measure of real success in life. And the one who's going to get all my stuff, going to get all my money, that one's a foreigner, a slave in my household. This is not an impressive or meaningful life. But the word of the Lord came to Abram again. Look toward the heaven and count the stars, if you are able. So shall your descendants be. You're not only going to have one kid, you're going to be blessed with a massive family. Life hadn't worked out for Abram the way he thought it should, and God's response to that was a promise. A promise. And it's not a guarantee. It's a risky thing. Promises aren't always kept. In some ways, a promise is something that is out in front of us, beckoning us toward it. It is not something that we can grasp and put in our pockets. It is much more elusive. And there are many these days who are trying to remove the elusive character of promise by means of all kinds of contracts, like prenuptial agreements. And while I have absolutely, hear me, I have absolutely no need to judge people who enter into these, they do represent a way of trying to guarantee life. What if real life is riskier than what a contract can provide? The book of Hebrews, in our second reading for today, gives us a remarkable take on the Abraham story, expanding what the original author meant by it. And this is what happens, especially in the book of Hebrews a lot. They take these ancient stories and then blow them up real big. This author starts with what we know seems to be a logical conclusion about the Abraham story. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was going to receive as an inheritance, and he set out not knowing where he was going. Again, a promise led the way. By faith, he stayed for a long time in the land he had been promised, as in a foreign land, living in tents. That is, living in that which isn't permanent or guaranteed. Why did Abraham do this? And this is where Hebrews expands on the original story. Hebrews says, because he looked forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Abram lived like he did because there was something massive out in front of him, calling him to it. And that something massive, according to Hebrews, not according to Genesis, but according to Hebrews, wasn't just a piece of land or a bunch of kids. Rather, it was God himself and the place where God abides or lives. After telling us about the faith of Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and Jacob, the author of Hebrews gives us this, what I think is profound and deeply unsettling insight. All of these died without having received the promises. But from a distance they saw and greeted them. And this insight is really the insight of the Moses story. Perhaps you know the Moses story. He leads the whiny Israelites for 40 years toward the promised land. Somebody in our Bible study the other day asked, why did it take them so long to get there? 40 years. And I said, well, one theory is it was men who were leading them, and they never stopped to ask for directions. I'm not sure that's the case. By the way, 40 is a number of, it's a symbolic number. It's a number that means a long enough time to get the job done, all right? For 40 years, they're roaming in the wilderness. And then they get to the promised land. Now, I hate this part of the story. They get to the promised land, and God says to Moses, you can't go in. You can't go in. And I think that story is not necessarily historical. That story is about our lives. We traveled for 40 years, for a long enough time to get the job done, and then we can't go into the promised land. Moses died living this side of fulfillment. And again, this is often the truth for all of us. We often live on this side of fulfillment. We live in the land of promise. There are no guarantees. The searching that we have in our souls, the longing that we have deep within us will not go away. They are a part of our hearts forever. You know, I really wish that we understood that. Because so many of us spend so much of our time trying to eliminate the search and the longing. Instead of embracing it, we often try to cover it up. That's why so many of us drink so much. It's why we spend so much time shopping and buying. Why some of us go from relationship to relationship to relationship. Why some of us use knowledge and scientific insight to attempt to answer every possible question that we could have. What if the truth is that to be human is to stand at a distance from the promises and sometimes only get to greet them? What if in some ways we never arrive? What if promise always leads the way? Now, I know when you hear that, you're going to say, that is a risky place to live in. And yes, it is. Risk almost always accompanies faith. Faith requires some jumping, some leaping, a great deal of risking. Sherry, my sister-in-law, and I went on the zip line yesterday, and when you get to that part where they open the doors and all you got to do is step out into midair, that's what faith is like. Faith is like that. It requires a great deal of risk. And I have found some words from Janet Rand about risk to be so helpful in understanding the character of faith. This is so good. She says, to laugh is to risk appearing the fool. To weep is to risk being sentimental. To reach out to another is to risk involvement. To expose your feelings is to risk showing your true self. To love is to risk not being loved in return. To live is to risk dying. To hope is to risk despair. To try is to risk failure. But, she says, risks must be taken because the greatest risk in life is to risk nothing. The person who risks nothing, does nothing, has nothing, and becomes nothing. She may avoid suffering and sorrow, but she simply cannot learn, feel, change, grow, or love. Chained by certainty, he is a slave. He has forfeited his freedom, and only the person who risks is truly free. Risk is tough. It's very tough. But it brings a much more meaningful life. Promise doesn't bring with it guarantee, but it makes life much more interesting. Life in promise and risk becomes more of what life really is. Not a story whose ending is already prescribed and known, whose details are all mapped out, but a mystery filled with twists and turns that is constantly leading us forward, eventually taking us to the land of God. Joseph Sittler, a man I wish were still alive, applies what I'm saying to marriage. He says, the heart of marriage is a promise. On the face of it, it's a crazy promise. Two people who only have a partial understanding of each other stand up and make this bizarre statement that they're going to cherish each other for a lifetime. To many people, this seems like a risky thing to do, and it is. But, and this is what Sittler says, the risk is the romance. The risk is what makes it interesting. Yeah, it may not work. Yeah, promises may not be kept. Yeah, the relationship one day may need to dissolve. But to approach living in relationships by not making promises or taking risk is to squeeze the life out of life. True life, the Christian faith would have us know, is found in faith, which always involves risk. True life is to set out for a place that we will receive only as an inheritance, doing so knowing not where we're going. True life is sometimes to view the promises from a distance. Now, sometimes, and I feel this strongly, sometimes you get a taste of the fulfillment. Abraham, who is said to have viewed the promises from a distance, who was as good as dead when God brought the promises to him, that means he was really, really old. That's what that means. He did have a son, and after eventually he died, received descendants as many as the stars of heaven and as innumerable as the grains of sand by the shore. Yeah, the Bible tends to exaggerate, but you get the point. In God, in the God of promise, there is abundance. True life is filled with abundance, even if sometimes the abundance is experienced as partial. Jesus in our gospel lesson today says, again, do not fear. Do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. The God who promises is the God who gives and gives and gives. And it is that promise that frees us to risk, to live controlled not by fear or by the need for certainty or guarantee. And it is this promise that is ultimately taking us to the land of God, which is the land of super abundance. Amen.